Okay, so I think everybody is coming in there, so we'll get started. I'm sure more people will join us as we go on. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keaveney. I'm a member of the Centre for Irish Towns. I'm based in the School of Agriculture and Food Science in UCD. And you're most welcome to our first Talking Towns webinar. I don't know what to call things these days, for the year. This is the first of three this term. So we're delighted to have this today. So we're joined today by three speakers. And just to flag, first of all, we are recording these sessions. We like to record them so we can share them afterwards and put them up on the website. So it's just to let you know, and you would have seen a little box to give your consent as you came in. You're obviously aware of what we're doing, and just to flag at the beginning, I'll mention it again at the end, we have our website on the UCD, part of the UCD website for CFIT. There is a mailing list there. You can join us on that to find out further details about our activities. So today we're looking at border towns. It's something that's come up very strongly in a lot of the workshops that we're doing across the universities, both on the island of Ireland and then with colleagues in Edinburgh as well over the last year or so. So we really wanted to focus on this today as our first webinar for this semester. So I'm delighted to be joined by three speakers today, or four speakers with three presentations. And they're Caroline Creamer, Killian Doherty, Paula McClosky, and Sam Vardy. So you're very welcome. So today we're going to start with Caroline Creamer. Caroline is Director of the International Centre for Local and Regional Development and a facilitator of the All Ireland Smart Cities Forum. She's also the SBON contact point for Ireland and a research fellow at Maynooth University Social Sciences Institute. Caroline is a qualified town planner, and she's worked for 20 years in research. My notes just went there. In research and management capacity on a number of funded projects in the area of regional government, regional development, urban and rural regeneration, spatial planning, governance, and collaborative networking and community participation. Over the last decade, Caroline has been working with local government, regional authorities, communities, and other key stakeholders in the Irish border region and Northern Ireland on a range of programmes focused on place shaping, rural revitalisation, and improving the lives of people on the island of Ireland. I know I've been lucky to work with Caroline for quite a number of years now, and that's ongoing. So I'm delighted to introduce her to the Centre for Irish Towns today. So over to you, Caroline. You're muted.
Sorry, I think I have learned about mute at this point in time. So thank you, Karen, for that lovely introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. And firstly, thank you to the Centre for Irish Towns for the invitation to speak today on Irish border and towns. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on the work of the ICLRD over the past 15 years or so on border towns and how those towns are dealing with the many and varied issues that they face. But I guess first, who are the ICLRD? My slides seem to be a little bit stuck. There we go. So the ICLRD was established in 2006. As an organisation, we were brokered by the North-South Ministerial Council to explore the role of local and regional development in nurturing and promoting peace and reconciliation on the island of Ireland, and the role particularly of planning within that. When constituted, it was seen that we would be an honest broker in that we play a key role in bridging policy and practice divides and being responsive to the needs of policymakers, particularly at a local government level. So we have a number of key work streams within ICLRD, from promoting disciplinary research activities to bespoke capacity building programs that are designed again to meet the needs of local and regional stakeholders, to translating policy into on-the-ground action, fostering collaboration, facilitating networks, etc. And you'll see elements of that now in the various programs that I'll speak to. But very much at the core of our work is the working proposition that borders matter. And they can take many forms, and they are largely social constructs, but borders are essential to international relations. Without them, in fact, there would be no international. And if we look at the European territory, there are border areas cover 40% of the EU territory and account for at least 30% of the EU's population. So the landscape of Europe, therefore, with its long tradition of cross-border collaboration, is strongly shaped and influenced by borders and their associated challenges and opportunities. They shape place, identity, trading and economic development patterns, and can impact on health and access to services. So border regions, for the most part, they tend to be rural and they tend to be peripheral, and thus face many challenges heightened by most states tending to prioritize the center over the periphery. And what better way to demonstrate these challenges than by a series of maps? And again, just looking at some maps of the island of Ireland, if we look at the motorway network for the island, if we look at the rail services for the island, and if we look at the gas network system for the island, very clearly we see big deficits in the border region. So when we look at borders and border towns, we are faced with a triple decker. In terms of borders, we are faced with the border between different groups across and within wider society, the border of a state, and the border of the EU, with the UK now a third country. And for border towns, we face a triple decker of issues. We have the global issues, we have the regional issues that give rise to a border effect, and we have local Pacific issues. Not all together unique, but definitely the scale and impact are significant. So taking those range of issues in turn, when we look at global issues, globally, border towns are facing many of the same generational challenges being faced by cities, towns, and villages across the world. Climate crisis, and linked to this, the depletion of natural resources and a loss of biodiversity, an aging demographic. If we look at the case of Fermanagh and Omagh District Council, for example, it is expected that by 2030, 23% of the population will be aged 65 and over, compared to 15% in 2015. And these statistics are replicated right across the border region. The legacy of economic disparities, the challenge of being on the periphery, and as a result, places being left behind. And an ongoing cycle of public authorities at all levels being interested or not in working together. So while these are global issues, what is different here for the border region is their distance from Dublin and Belfast and the resulting disconnect in policy and praxis. The challenge of policies not always aligning. Environmental challenges, for example, do not stop at a border, yet our policy responses do. And while the greater collaboration taking place between local authorities and local authority networks is to be acknowledged and applauded, playing catch up is a long road. In response, we can see how border communities are doing their part to address these global challenges. ICLRD recently worked with ICBAN, the Irish Central Border Area Network, in 2021, where they published their framework for regional priorities 21 to 27, which takes its strategic frame of reference from the SDGs, and which works with the strengths and asset base of the region, identifying a number of large-scale catalyst projects to stimulate a range of regions with a range of sectors within the region. and which it is envisaged will bring economic, social and environmental benefits to local towns and villages in this sub-region of the border. We go down then to the regional level. So the Irish border region remains a contested space, politically despite the Good Friday Agreement and almost 25 years of peace, but also indeed today because of Brexit. But it's also a physical and mental border, as many perceive the border to be inconsistent with local economic, community and social familial ties and patterns. Following partition, rural areas on both sides of the Irish border found themselves increasingly peripheral in their respective states. Distance from Dublin and Belfast and from other areas of growth arrested their development and increased their dependence on agriculture. The gradual withdrawal of public services, and in particular the closure of the railways, compounded this peripherality and disconnect. For decades, the dominant trend for communities was that once functional social, economic and social spatial areas was to live back to back. Towns and villages were cut off from their natural trading and retailing hinterlands, and businesses were cut off from their suppliers and their markets. The emergence of distinct and back-to-back approaches to spatial planning, economic development, infrastructure and service provision led to spatial exclusion. These disruptions contributed to a deepening of the considerable structural challenges faced by the Irish border region and its towns and villages, from demographic weaknesses, as we've already mentioned, to low population densities, a weak urban network, limited connectivity, and poor quality public services, altogether giving rise to what is termed the border effect. One of ICLRD's first studies on border towns was published in 2008, focusing on 5 cross-border settlement clusters along the 450-kilometre length of the border. ICLRD's study into small towns and villages is very much about examining the border effect and recognising and tapping into the potential of small, medium-sized towns and villages along the Irish border corridor so as to improve their socioeconomic circumstances and ensure their sustainable development in a balanced manner. The focus was on towns 15 kilometres either side of the border line. This is where it is said the border effect is at its strongest. It considered the nature and level of connectivity that exists between a number of cross-border towns and villages, which pre-partition and troubles would have been natural hinterlands and functional areas. It allowed us to examine the border as a tale of unintended and unforeseen consequences. The study was primarily about place and community. It allowed us to listen and reflect and work with the communities on joining some dots on potential next steps for them in terms of their journey of rediscovery, reconnection, and future cooperation. And that study and report is available from the ICLRD website. At a local level, the issues facing border towns can again be the same as those facing towns across the island of Ireland as a whole, from sense of place to the hollowing out of the town core, to associated vacancy and dereliction, to decline of traditional industries, which in turn are often replaced with other vulnerable industries, connectivity, both in terms of transport and broadband, and also understanding what is the unique selling point of each of these communities, what differentiates this place over another, how do they stand out, or how do they connect and cluster with other neighbouring towns when traditionally they've seen themselves as being in competition with each other, to more place-specific issues. For example, in the case study that we're about to look at, issues of locational context and indeed housing in the context of the mica crisis were also quite strong. So very specific to place. So it's important again to reiterate that while many of these issues are not unique to border towns, it tends to be more pronounced due to the peripherality of border towns from the centre. The example we're looking at here then is a study we undertook for Donegal County Council, looking at Buncrana and a geospatial analysis of it, looking at its strategic strengths and future strategic direction. Buncrana is very much a town in transition, yet it's also the gateway to Inishowen and the Northwest City Region corridor. Development has largely been orientated away from Lough Swilly, yet Lough Swilly is a natural amphitheatre for marine-based activities and sports, and indeed for professional marine training. It has a network of blue and green networks in the region, yet they're all linear, not connected, and they just need to be looped. Economic diversification is necessary there. It was very much dependent on textiles in the past, and now it needs a new orientation in terms of economic development. And it has Project Kelvin, high-speed broadband sitting right on its doorstep. And indeed, the overall setting of the location for Buncrana is just breathtaking. And indeed, I don't know if you've ever worked in a place that just captures your heart. Well, Buncrana was one of those towns for me and the team when we worked here back in 2020, a place we all deeply took to our hearts and really want to see succeed. And it has so much potential just waiting to be untapped. And I suppose that brings us then to just the concluding comments, in that border towns really are places of opportunity and have a key role to play in meeting the challenges of the 21st century. And in some ways, the peripherality and underdevelopment of these towns is now one of its core strengths as we look to the big global and regional challenges that we face. And I suppose part of that placemaking and development is capitalizing on its existing local assets and strengths, to which they have a rich diversity. But it's just making sense of those and connecting the dots, but also having the relevant supports. And here, local government plays very much a key role as being drivers. And already we can see lots of wonderful innovations happening on a cross-council basis in this space, where we have Donegal and Derry and Strabane councils scoping out the potential for a cross-border spatial strategy at the moment. Both councils having already worked on joint climate action plans and regional energy plans. In Mid-Ulster, Fermanagh, Omagh and Monaghan, they're working together on a statement of common ground, which is looking to joint action and policy alignment on the protection of our rivers and canals. But I suppose a big question is, again, the role of local planning. And I suppose the point is, it's not just planning, but it's also about our public realm. It's about our architecture. It's about our landscape. And it really is about joining the dots and getting the right teams of people together to work on these places and ensuring that we have policy alignment. And I think we still have a bit of distance to go in that respect. And Karen, conscious of time, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. And what I did mean to say at the beginning is we're going to do the three presentations together and then we'll have questions at the end. So Caroline, if you want to stop sharing your screen, then Killian can join us next. And do feel free to put questions into the chat as well. I'll keep an eye on them, and we'll hopefully have a few minutes for discussion at the end. So I'm delighted to introduce Killian Doherty next. Killian is a lecturer at the Edinburgh School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, and he is interested in the relationship between urbanisation and land-based conflict across sub-Saharan Africa. Killian has a particular interest in understanding how border constructions produce racial, ethnic, or religious conflict. His work, teachings, and research have been exhibited at the ICA, the Venice Architecture Biennale, and have appeared in Japan Architecture and Urbanism, Architectural Review, MAS, Context and Volume. So thank you, Killian. And I might pop in on the video when we're at about 10 minutes, in case you see my head appear.
Okay, can you see that now? Yeah?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. All right. Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to CIFT to talk about border towns. There's something sort of close to my heart. I'm sort of going to give a sort of more meandering kind of discussion about along borders, sort of through having kind of grown up in Derry, and how that sort of influenced the work that I've been doing over the past kind of 10 years. And I'll show some of that in Rwanda, and it really sort of like tries to understand, I suppose, what Caroline was talking about, the border, not effect, but the affect, so how it sort of conditions the built environment, and how that built environment sort of implicated in, you know, sites of intense conflict. And then I'll sort of show some kind of work that kind of deals with maybe understanding different interpretations of place kind of through border, or sort of through kind of transboundary kind of or transborder thinking. And then I'll kind of return to kind of some thoughts on Ireland or Irish border towns. So yeah, like I'm unashamedly going to start with an image by Doherty, the kind of artist, the visual artist from Derry. And so I'm kind of interested. I'm from the water side, which is here is east is north, and the Derry side is being west is south. So I'm sort of interested in the sort of arbitrary kind of nature of the borders, how they're sort of myopic constructions, and but intentional, and how they condition the built environment, and condition it sort of that they prohibit meaningful relations between people and the surrounding environment. And so they kind of condition our own understandings of the world as bound into these static units. I'm sort of interested, particularly the kind of role of kind of maps, as the way kind of maps and kind of borders are enacted sort of remotely, kind of from the top down, in the sort of disregard for the physical and human world. But I'm also this idea of the border as realizing these are man-made, these are constructs, and a sort of invitation to kind of study these as active thresholds, or thresholds for some kind of reciprocal exchange. And so so the presence of the kind of border in Derry kind of growing up, this sort of non-physical thing that affected the built and social environment, has been a curiosity that but it was really kind of when I moved to Rwanda and started living and working there, and that sort of it's kind of shaped kind of research that looks at kind of along these border situations across West and East Africa, and that's where these particular border constructions sort of condition certain types of architecture, particularly human settlements and towns, and how they're enmeshed or misunderstood in sort of our understanding of these racial or resource-based conflict. But it's important to remember that Africa, as we understand it today, and the nations that we understand, was a kind of project of border making. This is the image from the 1885 Berlin Conference, where the map of Africa was put on the wall, and Europe started to kind of divide it up. And so the kind of work that I do is sort of looks at those methods, but it's essentially the antithesis. It's sort of very kind of grounded work. And it looks at try to understand these other meanings of place, and how the border kind of affects or is radically alters people's ways of kind of living. And so the kind of work that I do kind of draws from architectural discipline of kind of drawing and mapping, but it also kind of uses narrative methods of walking and filmmaking. So these practices that aren't really fixed by borders, and this can sort of move with the hopes and desires of these kind of border communities. Some of this maps are from working with forest communities in Rwanda, which I'll kind of return to, and the different sort of interpretations of the landscape and the border. And so the intention, and this is sort of like the sort of walks that we kind of do, long walks over a number of days, and there's a series of drawings and methods involved in that. And so the intention is really to kind of use design to initiate sort of transboundary dialogue. So like the idea that the knowledge moves across the border, or it overcomes it. And so these dialogues kind of lead to ideas and proposals where the built environments are not really working against the border, but kind of through the shared space and experiences within the kind of landscape. So it's sort of like a kind of regional kind of thinking. So here is a particular kind of border site that I'm interested in, and this is the town of Goma that lies on the border between Rwanda and the DRC. And this is a figure ground of the town that lies on that border. And that border was formed in 1910 as a result of an Anglo-German treaty, but involved the Belgians as well. They were fighting over this kind of territory. It's this border kind of runs through the town. So on the left-hand side, you can see Goma, which was under Belgian rule. And on the right-hand side, you can see, sorry, on the left-hand side is Goma under Belgian rule. On the right-hand side was Goma, or is Goma under Belgian and then German rule. But it's just interesting to see how the town, the sort of different, the town is kind of developed under these different kind of colonial rules. But what is kind of interesting is how on this is a kind of site or a threshold during the genocide when up to 1 million people kind of passed through as a result of the Rwandan genocide, and then passed over into Gisenyi, or into Goma, and which coincided with the Second Congolese War between 1998 to 2003. And so there was a death of around 5.5 million people in this kind of area and sort of pushing through this. And so there was about half a million people just outside this area in refugee camps today. And so the border conditions this sort of refugee urbanism right along the kind of Rwandan Congolese border. But sort of my focus is on the Rwandan side and sort of how this kind of displacement is, how this is sort of conditioned, sort of the built environment on the other side is conditioned. So I'll try to kind of show you this video, see if it'll work. Whoops. If I have time. It's just to kind of give you a bit of context. You can see kind of where Goma Gisenyi will pop up here, and the boundary kind of runs through this kind of forested landscape. So these are the kind of main conservation areas kind of within that, and the border kind of splits through it. But these kind of areas, this kind of landscapes were primarily inhabited by an indigenous hunter-gatherer community. These nomadic communities, you'll see the kind of vector should pop up in a minute. Sorry, this is sort of how this area relates to the main city of Kigali. But you see this kind of yellow vector. And so as a result of the kind of partitioning over the kind of past 100 years, they've been kind of forced out of the forests. These forests are the main habitat to the mountain gorillas. But on the outside, on the periphery of this, is a kind of several hundred kind of settlements. These are the kind of rivers that feed into the kind of main river that fuels Kigali. So these are a number of several 100,000 people, indigenous communities that have been kind of displaced. And this area is like an area we begun to kind of map and narrate. So the border kind of runs through this model, but through the kind of these indigenous communities narrations, it doesn't really exist. So where these kind of border forests, this is a kind of like government image showing the kind of border in the forest, where the kind of border forests are controlled by the government for guerrilla tourism, amongst many other things. They're kind of mapped to sort of empty and static, but kind of with, but the Twa, these indigenous communities map these kind of landscapes without the border, and it's sort of continuous, dynamic and polyvalent terrain of like natural resources and animals. They're living amongst really kind of, it's extremely kind of rich in biodiversity, but this is a map of their kind of movement, and it kind of cuts across back and forth the kind of border. And so these kind of visualizations, these kind of maps are kind of working alongside these civil societies within Uganda and across the border in Rwanda. And these sort of mappings sort of like have produced kind of landscape strategies as a ways to kind of like negotiate kind of new territories at the edge of these borders for these communities. And what they're really kind of what really emerges is kind of different ways to kind of reconsider the kind of landscape, but through their knowledge. And what I mean by that is where Rwanda's conservation policy is sort of centers on the forestation of a singular species. This is kind of, the idea is to kind of allow the indigenous knowledge to kind of somehow begin to kind of inhabit these activities. And so this kind of scheme and this kind of project is a scheme to include indigenous knowledge within the kind of landscapes at a much larger scale. This, you can see where Goma Gisenyi is in the Twa's regional landscape. This is, these red vectors represent forest communities that span from Rwanda to Cameroon, and there's a kind of population of close to 1 million, and across 1.5 million square kilometers of these forests. And this is kind of supported by an NGO called Forest Peoples Program. So the idea is the kind of like drawings and the narrative work, this kind of trans-border work, begins to kind of support kind of policy change or advocate for it. But back to the matter of Ireland's border towns. So these, as Caroline had mentioned, the towns are an extension of the countryside. They're always overlooked, and they have to compete with the larger cities. And so this is something we know. But I would say the kind of towns along the Irish border, I would even more say are even more overlooked, as they're kind of situated on the margins. And this kind of difficulty of this jurisdictional divide and this inconsistency of policy. And these policies kind of, this inconsistency, the border kind of conditions gaps in the knowledge. And so kind of for me, I mean, these gaps and rifts are going to be worsened by Brexit. But sort of, this is kind of what I find is kind of really particularly interesting about them. You know, they're really powerful sites for study, particularly how the social environmental realities of climate change disregard the existence of borders. And so what we know of borders, or the way borders are made, is like, say, how colonial powers often delineated these remotely, reading from maps and looking for easy natural features such as rivers to act as borders. That's the case in large parts of Africa, but it's also the case, I mean, here along the western border, of how Northern Ireland was formed by the River Foyle and the River Finn and parts of the River Erne. And you can see in this image just the kind of watershed and how it sort of transcends or cuts through the kind of border, but where these border towns, some of these border towns are situated. I'm particularly interested in Strabane and Lifford and Balleek. And so I think there's kind of real kind of potential there to kind of think through, think in terms of this kind of trans-boundary kind of way of thinking, but like kind of through the kind of wetness of the landscape and these kind of catchment areas. So you can see here on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, I've got an image from, it's the Northern Ireland flood data maps for Strabane and Lifford and for Balleek. And you can see how that kind of data stops at the border. So the border begins to kind of condition these knowledge gaps and sort of our understandings of how these towns work, but how they're kind of affected by climate change. And there's, I think this work, the kind of catchment care, I think they're an organisation that are cross-border, and they're like kind of looking at, they look at the kind of landscape through the kind of catchment of the river catchments. So for me, I think this is the idea that the kind of rivers and the water and the environment doesn't necessarily follow these political man-made borders, but rather as a kind of catchment area that is transboundary is really fascinating. So I think something through the kind of shared knowledge, experience of flooding and this kind of wetness of the landscape has huge potential for cross-border knowledge. So I will leave it at that and I'll pass it over.
Thank you so much, Killian. You really get that sense of layering through maps. You know, it's actually, you know, it's a nice fit there. There's so many ways of looking at it. So I'm going to move on, and I see a couple of comments in the chat, so keep adding if you wish, and then we'll get a chance to discuss. So finally, I'm going to introduce Sam, Vardy, and Paula Mcclesby. Paula is an artistic researcher and teacher in the School of Arts, Derby University in the UK, and Sam is the head of architecture at NTU Cork. Together, A Place of Their Own is the art and spatial research practice of Paula and Sam. It's a transdisciplinary collaborative research projects which critically investigate entanglements of geopolitics, art and the climate crises through an intersectional anti-colonial approach and feminist praxis. They are interested in the collaborative creation of new imageries and have co-produced site-specific performances and installations, videos and publications concerning borders, wetlands, geopower, extraction, kinship and ecology. The work has been shown in Ireland, Europe, the UK and the US and was included in the ASEF Culture 360 Creative Responses to Sustainability UK Green Guide 2021. So thank you, Sam and Paula, for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Karen. introduction. Can I just, before we get started, just double check that you're seeing the right version of my screen? You're getting the right one? Yeah, great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for the invite to talk today. Very appreciated. So we are a place of their own, and our spatial art practice and research develops experimental methodologies to explore the border and border towns in Ireland and the notion of borders more widely. Our work attempts to escape what John Agnew called the territorial trap of nation-state imposed sovereign borders, to reconfigure questions of citizenship and agency of those living in, or more accurately, as Gloria Anzaldúa shows us in her book Borderlands, living with borders and borderlands and a borderland subjectivity. So today, just to focus in on a particular aspect of our work, we wanted to use two projects, current projects, in which we investigate different ways that people of border towns not only resist sometimes imposed borders, but in particular use diverse, complex and creative tactics or approaches and practices to write their own potential histories of borders, their own experiences of borders, and their own futures of borders. So the first project, just to mention, because of time relatively briefly, is a British Academy and Leverhulme funded project we're working on to develop a process of making and develop the platform of a digital counter-cartography of the Border Busters. Border Busters were self-organized practices throughout the 1970s, 80s and 90s to the British imposed border in Ireland. And here we see a variety of different locally self-organized forms of activity to unmake the border and the road closures and so on. As part of this activity near the town of Swallenbar, you can just see there on the near the yellow line of the border, it mentions the Border Buster. And here was still stands this yellow digger to commemorate those activities and different practices. So in this cartography, we are exploring a range of different characteristics and approaches that the different local people and people from other cities, including some in the UK, took to dismantle and to remake and rethink these border points. And we're thinking about what it means to actually conceive of a kind of cartography in this context. We're informed by the 3Cs Cartographies Collective, who say that they envisage in mapping and counter mapping in order to render alternative images of spatial and social relations and to destabilize centered and exclusionary representations and construct unorthodox imaginaries and practices of collective struggle. So to finish this very brief discussion of this particular project, some of the things that we are starting to explore through interviews with people who were involved in these actions are these kind of characteristics to the sense of agency and action. As I've said, self-organized, incredible sort of experiences of solidarity and collective action from different places. But also the way that the Irish language and the land itself also countered the kind of hegemonic logics of the colonial construction of the border, in a similar way to how Killian's described it in the last presentation. And what we kind of calling, inspired by Lisa Tilley, these kind of other land-based ontologies of the border, which include these long-standing practices of transhumance and gavelkind. So now just to pass on to Paula to talk about the second project, which is Ellen.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Sam. So yeah, I think it kind of goes back a bit, to talk about why our interest in borders, specifically the border in Ireland. So it comes from not for a lot of people who are interested specifically in borders. It comes from from being a child of the border, and so I was born in my parents from Ballyshannon, which is a border town in Donegal. And I was born in the mid-1970s at the height of the Troubles, and my dad's Irish Catholic and my mum's Irish Protestant. So they were married in Dublin, and then we moved to England when I was very little, when they had they were very young, and moved to England when I was young. And yeah, so when we left, for them, growing up in Ballyshannon was very, their memories of that time, they were both born in the mid-50s, and Ballyshannon is a small town, which had kind of, lots of rich history. And just after they were born, the whole town was transformed by when the Assaroe Falls was diverted into a hydroelectric station. And their parents before them, again, were from the Irish Catholic and Protestants, were children of the post-partition years. And my mum's family, the Protestant family, were extremely poor, farming people, but then moved from rural Donegal to her parents to Ballyshannon. So yeah, and for me, Ballyshannon, we would always go home after living in England for 10 years. We would drive over from then living in Leicester as an Irish family and spend all our holidays with my Catholic grandma. So all these different kind of markers of the border were there throughout my childhood, and throughout how my mum and dad navigated the differences in their backgrounds themselves, but also having this shared experience of coming from Ballyshannon, and obviously having the family together. So yeah, so that was really this idea with which Sam mentioned, Gloria and Zaldua, with this idea of how we don't cross borders cross us, and how that kind of marks and how that goes across generationally as well, so temporally, spatially, but also in terms of this embodied experience. Sam and I worked together, but with partners as well, and we started working on the border. So we moved back to Enniskillen in the late 1980s when I was a teenager. So we moved from Ballyshannon to England, and then moved to Enniskillen in Fermanagh, so we could be close to Ballyshannon. So again, this kind of, and that was 2 years after the Remembrance Day bombing in Enniskillen, which is another culture shock from being in England to a border town in the Republic, and then coming to Enniskillen at that time. And I moved away in my late teens again back to England. So we've had this ongoing relationship between borders and bodies. So Sam and I started working in 2011, really, across the border when we had small children, and we did this first crossing as a place of their own across the border, the 499 kilometres with our young children, through the towns and rivers and peat bogs, and all the while looking at this kind of signs of the border as well as we were crossing it spatially, looking at changes in language with our children, phone networks, radio frequencies, listening to the birds, the streams, and all these places that we knew, that Killian spoke about, the arbitrary nature of the border across Ireland. And yeah, we listened out for different accents as well as we would drive across the border with our children, and this kind of, as many people have done before, to try and make sense of what this border means to them. And yeah, so and just we had a real sense of this, what the border was in terms of the abandoned garages that I was used to, the forgotten houses, outbuildings, abandoned RUC and army barracks and all these kind of infrastructure of the border, and the kind of ghosts of the border, is the hard border, which was there when I was growing up. So Sam, will you move on to the next slide? Oh, I can do that. Yeah, so we're in Bleak. Yeah. So this relates to the Ella. So later on, and it was post Brexit that the referendum, we returned to this with this practice of Ella, and this is a art and spatial practice which was about us starting to go back to the border to challenge this notion of sovereign borders, and again use this idea of the body and border to create this character Ella, where I perform on the border across the different border sites, whether it's rivers, bogs, towns, and which we started to develop this, from which we started to develop this idea of border fiction in. So Ella is really like a transmuter, a shapeshifter, and has as a character. And the films that we make show how it kind of helps us to weave through the different temporalities of the borders, the different spatialities, and to start to really think about all the different knowledges of borders, whether that's long forgotten myths, the histories of trauma, the shifting people, the spirits, or the deep times of the bog. So it's this kind of artistic way to engage and to kind of remake this particular border, while also thinking about the border kind of phenomena, not just locally, but thinking about it as a planetary condition. So these are some stills from the film, from one of the films. We make these films from these performances. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Sam?
Territories showing at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is the second last slide, but just to add in there that this particular triptych is significant because it kind of sort of demonstrates one of the potentials of the films to be able to kind of fold different themes and concerns of the project together. So the white cryptic butterfly, which is native to the island of Ireland, is a key kind of figure within the piece, as is kind of archival footage from the 1920s in Bleak, which is down the bottom right there, which was also the site of that first image, the concrete background. So there's something about the kind of practice of site-specific performance moving through into digital audio films and exhibitions and other formats. The last thing just to mention briefly is a current call for papers that we have up for the Architecture and Culture Journal. Also to say, I think time's probably up, so just to say thanks.
Thank you so much. And that's maybe leave that there for a second if you want to take a note of the deadline. It really strikes me in what everyone has been talking about is it's very much about the everyday lives and the everyday geographies of people that I think everyone has talked about the social construct of a border, the border, but it reminds me as well of one of kind of Ireland's great geographers was Anne Buttermere, and she would talk about how we only get a sense of attachment to place when we experience loss. But in one sense with the border, it's a continual cycle of loss and change and precarity. So in one sense, if it's continual, what does that mean? I don't know, it's a bit of a rhetorical question, but that's what's striking me. And yet you have to live your life day to day. Like I know from the town study that Caroline did a number of years ago now, it was very much about that natural catchment. And Killian's work there, and I think Colin, you have a question there in the chat about it. We don't necessarily visualize our day-to-day movement, We just do, we just act, we just produce that space. So I don't know, does anybody have, there's a couple of questions in the chat, which I'm going to go to, but does anybody else want to, you can raise a hand if you want to ask something. But I don't know if Colin Murray, if you're still there, if you want to ask Killian maybe, or if there's anything in particular you mentioned about the visualization of the maps.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You know, I was fascinated by those mappings of journeys through guerrilla landscape in Congo, Rwanda, and the idea of studying them versus the idea of living them, of using them, of being the person who makes that journey without a map, without it being mapped, because you possess the territory in your head and you make use of it in a way that is unconcerned with the geopolitical niceties or the questions of nationhood, the line on the map. And how the line exists in people's heads, I suppose, seems to me to be an interesting question, if it exists in people's heads.
Should I, do you want me to say a bit more about the map? I mean, the language of the map and the way is important, because I mean it emerges from it's counter mapping, and it's really comes from counter mapping but within land advocacy, and they use the kind of formal sort of language of the map, which is sort of colonial language. You know, it's important that they use that to apprehend it, right? And so the language of the map and the moving was sort of like, but the difference of being kind of, it wasn't static, okay, and it was dynamic. So, but you're right that the Twa who mapped that don't have access to those spaces today, but it's through kind of memory. But the memories, the point of eviction for some of them was more recent. So, but they're continually talking about it, and they're continually, literally living on the margins of it. They're always trying to sort of like, they're at the edge of it, still trying to get in. So, but the point is, and I mean, this is sort of, I was working with a social and cultural anthropologist for Forest People's program, and when I talked about the accuracy of it, it really bothered me. I was all, you know, they're not there to validate this, and he goes, but that's not the point. The point is sort of like, you know, the differences of maps is sort of wayfinding. For them, they don't need maps. Maps are pointless. Yeah, in the same way, and I mean that's sort of like, in a way, the sort of map is a sort of a metaphor for the house, you know, that they live in. They don't need the house either. The house is useless to them. It's about land and sort of like moving and living off the land. But but yeah, they're just through their experience and narrating that, but it sort of brings into play the kind of reason to use physical models, and this is sort of part of the way the anthropologists work. You know, it's sort of, we built a physical model of the landscape, and it's built with them. And even though again that it just sort of helps, it helps them. It gives sort of more accuracy to the narration, because there's like mountains and profiles, and they can sort of read that. But yeah, it's a kind of tricky one. But it situates itself within the kind of language of counter mapping and apprehending the kind of language of the map, you know. But yeah.
I think Orla, I don't know if you have a question there. I don't know if you want to ask it. Orla Murphy.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Thank you all very much. Really rich and very very thought-provoking presentations. I suppose I was struck by the points about, firstly, the border being left behind in some cases because of the peripheral status, for example, of towns on the border, and being away from the centre in terms of access to infrastructure, access to service, access to the effects of policy. And it strikes me that the through your descriptions, there's a sense of multiple readings of borders, that they're subject to multiple readings and multiple ways of understanding them. And you know, we've so nice to see that really beautiful polyvalent ways of mapping and understanding using different media. I'm wondering, on then the flip side of that, does that peripheral character or that border nature present opportunities that aren't singular, but that are enjoy that difference or that polyvalence?
Well, I mean, it really sort of gets to the nub of, I mean, maybe questions about like how water is an element, you know, that is more treated as a sort of infrastructural, yeah, or you know, that has to be sort of controlled. So I'm just thinking about, you know, the fact that you can see how the river catchment, and it sort of it's got nothing to do, it drifts across the border, yeah. But I'm just kind of thinking, you know, like certainly in kind of Rwanda, and I mean it's an entirely different context, but the way that the landscape, wetlands landscapes are inhabited and kind of used, you know. I'm not saying that Irish towns could be reimagined as a wetland landscape, but I do think that once you begin to show how the border sits with the water, you're sort of, you know, it's sort of the border becomes to be dismantled, and we begin to kind of think of new ways that we could reimagine that. And even if the way, you know, the sort of the town, the border conditions, the movement of the town across the rivers, but we can see the catchments kind of are transboundary. So, you know, I think it begins to ask questions about like what is the growth of the towns across that, or sort of alongside it, you know. So I mean, yeah, I think just a series of kind of like studies of that, mapping it would be a really good way in, and sort of using some of the language, methods that Sam and Paul is doing as well. I mean, it's like it's not just mapping is such a kind of broad discipline, you know. But
Paula or Sam, do you have anything to add there?
I mean, I think like I think there's something with all these, you know, as contested spaces, and not just you know, whether it's in Ireland or wherever, and borders being kind of highly charged spaces, they are spaces of a very specific kind of knowledge, and they're kind of so so to be of and from a border, it is a specific kind of subjectivity, which I think is generative of different ways of thinking, and not just for like this kind of the trans boundary, you know, because I think that's really important. I love what Killian's saying about the waterways, and this, and across climate studies, the whole thinking of trans boundaries is really important. So I think that's really rich and generative, but also in terms of the kind of knowledges of the people as well who live there, who have this, like, again, it tapped into what Killian was saying about his work, and that it is about these other knowledges from those places. So and it's a, you know, the local knowledge is incredibly important, and holds that potential, I think.
I might cheekily ask what I'm going to say is the last question. I'm totally confusing my role. I'm going to ask Caroline, just for reflecting on these sort of everyday lives and the everyday geographies, do you think, does policy have an ability to actually take this on board? Like Paula's talking about that, you know, listening and reflecting, and I know from my area, I would talk about bottom-up approaches. Like, is there actually space in policy to hear these less tangible elements of the border?
Yes, it's a good question. I think there is, but it's not probably happening at the pace that we want it to happen, or we need it to happen. And so what we're seeing then is in its place where we have a lot of innovation then happening at local authorities, but indeed actually even before it happens at local authorities, it's very much happening on the ground, where communities are coming together and in some ways demanding the change that they want to see happening. You know, Killian mentioned how border alters people's way of living, and in some ways absolutely it did, but you also had this fight back against that, and I think, you know, when we that the border towns study, when we went out and met with communities, you know, it was still all very fresh in people's minds, the experiences that they had gone through. And it was all still very recent, given, you know, that study was only 10 years really after the peace process. But there was, they told us wonderful stories of how they, I suppose, rallied, I suppose, against the impositions that were put in place, the road closures. So if the roads were closed and barriered off, well, they'd go and put some planks across the local river or stream to ensure that they could have those cross-community connections, or to facilitate elderly within the community getting to mass easily, you know, even if it was on a cross-community basis. So I think definitely it's coming from community, and we have rich and really strong place-based leaders out there who are increasingly, I suppose, stepping up and engaging with local government, and local government then are taking the shift. And in some ways then national policy is kind of, it's behind the curve in that, and it's playing catch up. And so, you know, I think it's going to continue like that, where local authorities are definitely the key players here. And indeed, I think the regional assemblies will kick into their own here with the new resource strategies. And, you know, kind of when we've looked at the border communities and we've looked at that whole area of vacancy and dereliction and the potential that throws up now in light of the major housing crisis that we have. You know, the Northern and Western Regional Assembly have done some amazing work on vacancy. I think there was new CSO data out on vacancy again today as well. And again, it's highlighting the very high levels in our border counties. And so we really need to kind of look now at what the opportunities in that space are.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's a really good way to end. I think I feel we've brought it full circle, starting kind of with that policy and then really going into the layers and returning to it. And I know I see a couple of policy people there that I'm familiar with. So hopefully, and I know they do listen. So look, thank you very much to all our speakers. I think there was a really valuable mix and layering of the topic around the border. And I think there's even more to talk about. We will have 2 more Talking Town seminars over the next couple of months. I've put up the link there in the chat for our website. Please feel free to keep an eye on that and our social media. And also we do have a mailing list if you're not on it, and it's on that link also. So thank you so much for the engagement and for everybody joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again in another few weeks at our next Talking Towns. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.